Yeah, my name is Fabio. I work at Common Code. I'm mainly a digital designer, doing some front end as well. I'm getting a bit more into front end now. Before that, I was just mainly hacking on WordPress templates. But yeah, so Common Code, we mainly work with things like Django, React, Meteor, so mainly Python and JavaScript. And most of the time we just build MVP. Is everyone familiar with the concept of MVP here? Anyone needs me to go through that? Cool. You know what is it? So yeah, for us, it's very important, the idea of building something that doesn't have to be perfect at the first delivery, but we want that thing to be easy to change later in the future. We don't want to spend too much time just refactoring CSS all the time just because the very first iteration was shit. What I'm talking to you guys today is it's more about an experience that I had at Common Code, where basically a client came back saying they wanted to redesign completely their app, which means all the CSS had to be refactored. And the app was running on Meteor 1.2. We wanted to change to Meteor 1.3, and because of that, thanks to NPM, we also wanted to start using React component. So my part was to start redesigning the thing, and my very big mistake was thinking that I could have just gone bit by bit. So just start by redesigning one part and maybe just implement a new navbar and then implement a new sidebar, and that didn't work. There was like some crazy CSS clashing in there, and basically, I mean, that's how I was feeling. It was so random. I had no idea what was going on, and at some point I had to stop because it clearly wasn't working. So we did a bit of research. We started looking at technologies, methodologies that they could help us. Stuff that I've heard of before, but I was never using in an extensive way. So we decided, all right, just chill for now, see what's around, and we come up with this idea that we do not want just to redesign an application, but we want to find a system, basically define a vocabulary that we can then use each time without having to invent or just leave stuff for some other developer or other designer to decide later on. So we decided to look at this. We decided to start using things like ATOMIC Design and then ITCSS, and as I was saying before, React. What all these things have in common is that they make extremely easy, and it's basically their core concept. It makes it very easy to use components, and it really encourages you in using components rather than seeing your application as templates or just pages. Are you all familiar with ATOMIC Design? Yeah, cool. So well, in that case, just really quickly, ATOMIC Design comes from Brett Frost. Great idea. It wants to explain the inheritance of design elements you referencing to science. So we have something like a button, and we call it atom. We have like a small contact form, like a field plus a button, and we call that molecule. And then we have something like this little pop-up, like a model thing, and that's an organism because it's atom that puts together from a molecule, which put together form an organism. So that's, I believe, pretty simple. But seriously, looking at the CSS part and as a developer, all this stuff is just components for us. We don't really care if someone calls it atoms or molecule. So what we really want to see is just a bunch of components that put together, create other components, which can create other components, but at the same time we want these components to being able to function if we put them on their own. I mean, not all the time, but sometimes we want just to be able to reuse that component without having to worry about where we placed it in other iteration. Which is why we looked at the ITCSS architecture. ITCSS architecture makes it extremely simple to categorize each of your CSS elements, let's say. We can just separate what's just boilerplate and what's like CSS setting to what is the actual components that we want to work with. So, yeah. So I just say that, so cool. And the way it does that is, which thanks to SAS, we can just divide all our style sheets, and then we can import them, just separating, like I can have all my variables together, I can have all my like reset and normalize, I can have my mixing, and then just going down to the bottom, we can have all our components. Now, all the components aren't really the same. So we have components like buttons, for example, which we can just translate into atoms. We have components like form, molecule, but what's really important for us, they're all components. And but what's interesting about it is that we see these sort of hierarchy between components. So I'm still wondering if like I should add into this ITCSS structure like a subfolder where I say, okay, these are my child components, these are my parents component, which is something that basically React encourage to do. So yeah, like something like the organism, which is like that model box component that I was showing before. So, and to almost conclude, sorry, I lost my mouse for a second. Working with components this way, it just makes it so much easier for us to maintain, let's say, our app, because later on we can just go straight to that specific component without having to worry about everything else. And creating these UI components library, we have a list of all the components that we're going to use, and we sort of, I mean, in the positive way, restrain ourselves from creating like random stuff just because we need it, but we need to find a way of using that stuff in order to create, to implement our design. So I'd say it's just a way to give us designers and us front-end developers rules and make sure that we're working in a very tidy and consistent way. And then, yeah, I mean, I have some further reading that you might grab later if you watch the video or stuff. And that's pretty much it. If you guys are particularly interested about this, I can show you a little bit how we actually structure the files and what it actually is gonna like. I can show you my latest project and see how that looks. And yeah, I guess I'm done. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.